So just earlier today, I woke up and I saw that the A Court of Thorns and Roses adaptation that's been planned at Hulu and been in the works for a while was canceled, and apparently Sarah J. Maas is going to look for other places to get an adaptation made. But it's just been in my head for the past couple hours now, and it's making me want to make this impromptu video where I'm, I don't have a script, I don't have any notes or anything, but it's just some thoughts I've been having for a little while. And basically, the world that a lot of us grew up in, if you're younger than me, that this may not apply to you, but the world that a lot of us grew up in terms of pop culture, isn't around anymore. Pop culture, as we used to think of it, is dead. It just no longer exists. You could no longer have something like Harry Potter or Twilight or The Hunger Games or, anything else that big anymore. It will not happen. Now, think about Harry Potter for a second. It was, originally just a children's book series, which eventually kind of evolved into being more young adult. And it's, like, the books were really big and popular. And because they were really big and popular, they were able to leverage that into becoming movies. And then the movies and books kind of started a feedback loop where they both fed into each other. The more popular the books got, the more popular the movies got, and vice versa. And then they started making more merchandise and video games and toys and a fucking theme park now. There's just all kinds of stuff there. It went from being really popular books to being a multimedia juggernaut franchise. And then not long after that, we got Twilight, which is obviously, it's still aimed at more of a kids or young adult market, but it's a very different type of story. I think we can agree that they're aiming for different niches.
How long have you been 17?
A while.
In fact, this year, 2025, is the 20th anniversary of the release of the first Twilight book, as well as the 20th anniversary of the Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire movie. Like 20 years ago, when these came out, the final Harry Potter book hadn't even come out yet. Like, Deathly Hallows was 2007. Also, YouTube is now 20 years old, so I hope you all just feel very decrepit right now. But the thing is, Twilight, while it was aimed at a different niche, was still a massive, massive success. The books were a massive success, and then a couple years later, they made movies for those. Those were a massive success. And just like Harry Potter, they created a sort of feedback loop which fed into each other. And then later, we got The Hunger Games, more or less the same thing. But you'll notice that there's kind of diminishing returns on this. Like, Harry Potter, massive, massive thing that's still around today. Twilight, again, massive, massive thing, but it did kind of eventually just go away. Like, once all the movies were out, that was about it. Hunger Games, the movies and books were, again, a big success, but less successful than Twilight, and they've also largely went away, other than some weird nostalgic cash grab spin-offs that they're making right now. Like, I will defend A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, but I'm not sure why they're making another spin-off. And now we've reached something like A Court of Thorns and Roses, and before that, A Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas, which I have read Throne of Glass. They're not good books. You can look at my thoughts on them from, 5 years ago now? You can look at my thoughts on them. I don't think they're good books, but they are undeniably very, very popular. And yet, despite that popularity, despite that inbuilt audience that Sarah J. Maas has, and you'd think anyone who's looking to get an adaptation off the ground, you'd think they would just go, oh yeah, we could easily just make this, maybe give it a big budget, maybe give it a more modest budget, but either way, we could make it into a movie or a TV show or something. We'd have a guaranteed number of eyeballs on it. Let's do it. Let's make this. And you'd think it would cause the same pattern to happen again, where they feed into each other, create a big a big feedback loop, and then it becomes a genuine cultural phenomenon. Because while I am someone who's in the world of books, I'm in the world of fantasy, I think if you ask the average person on the street about A Court of Thorns and Roses, they've probably never heard of it. Whereas back in the day, if you asked someone who purposely avoided anything to do with Harry Potter or The Hunger Games or Twilight, even if they avoided that, they would still at least know what those were, and they would know a little bit about it. Like, they would go, oh yeah, Twilight, that's about sparkly vampires, I guess. I don't know, it sounded stupid to me, so I just moved on. They would at least know what Twilight was and understand a little bit about it. That's not the case for things like ACOTAR. That's not the case for Throne of Glass. That's not the case for whatever other books are getting really big nowadays. And I think this applies to other stuff to an extent. But I'll get to that in a minute. Basically, the internet helped to create the massive, massive success of those other 3 book series that I keep mentioning: Harry Potter, Twilight, Hunger Games. Like, the internet helped to create those. And hell, you can see this phenomenon to a lesser extent outside of those 3. I'm just choosing those because those are like the best known examples. I think the Da Vinci Code would also be a good example of this. Like, that book brought the world to a standstill in like 2003 or whenever it came out, and then a couple years later the movie brought it to a standstill. And I haven't actually read the book, and I've only seen part of the movie, so I can't comment on the quality of those, but it was huge. I was a kid when it happened, but I remember it was huge. And all of these were able to become not just like bestsellers, because they were originally bestsellers. The reason they became such huge juggernauts that like they had to make movies of them was that the internet allowed them to become big. You know, because like back before smartphones were a thing, back before social media was a thing, we would talk to people on like internet forums or chat rooms occasionally. Email lists were a thing. You ever heard of email lists, young people in the audience? Yeah, like that's literally, you would sign up somewhere and people would send out like newsletters, or they would send out chapters of their fan fictions, or like there'd be stuff where it's like, oh, it's essentially an online magazine, and they just have 1 or 2 articles about Harry Potter and just send it out to whoever signed up once a month, twice a month, something like that. It's kind of weird to talk about and hard to explain to people nowadays, but like that was a thing. And these communities of people were able to find each other, and they created like a real fandom, as opposed to just having a book, reading it a couple of times and being really into it, maybe chatting about it with your friends. They created like actual communities, actual fandoms, and they were creating things like fan fiction and fan art, and going into weird theories about where they thought the books were going to go next, and having discussions about stuff. Like, this really just blew up. And while fandoms do still exist nowadays, they're kind of hard to keep going or to make as big or as rabid as they were back then, for the simple reason that we have so many other things competing for our attention. Because, you know, 20 years ago, the internet was a place. You know, you didn't have smartphones back then. Cell phones were a thing, but they weren't as ubiquitous as they are now. Like, everybody didn't have one. And they were also simple. Like, you used them for calling, texting. Some of the fancier ones had cameras on them. But that was about it. It was like something you used to contact your friends, or if you needed to contact the police or something in an emergency. Whereas the internet, you had usually just one computer in your house. It was usually a family computer. Some people who are a bit more bougie might have had their own personal one, but you know, it was just there. And if you went online, it was usually only an hour a day, 2 hours a day, something like that. And you had to actually go out and seek things that you were looking for. You know, you didn't have social media that was aggregating a ton of content for you to just browse through endlessly. Like, look, here's memes, here's political news, here's whatever. Like, you had to actively go out and seek it. And because you were actively going to a place, the internet, and actively seeking out something, whether that be looking for news on something, or trying to discuss something on a forum, or whatever, that forced you to like lock in and actually pay attention to what you were doing. Like, you probably wouldn't be doing that and watching TV and listening to music and trying to download a new video game or something all at once. You probably weren't going to do that. You're probably doing 1, maybe 2 things at a time. Whereas nowadays, if you are, the internet isn't a place, it's just always with you nowadays. It's just a thing you use. So if you're like watching a show on streaming or something, or reading a book or whatever, you will, in all likelihood, a lot of people will be also browsing their phone while they're doing it, or at least be tempted to do so while they're doing it. And so because of that, the passion for fandom just isn't really there anymore. And again, I'm not saying people don't still do fan art, they don't still do discussions and all that. It just is a pale imitation of what it was even 10 years ago. And again, with the internet always being with us, there's just always more content being churned out. And that just didn't used to be the case. You know, when YouTube was first created, we used to get like 1 viral video every 6 months, and we would just kind of rewatch that over and over again. You know, like, I can't even tell you how many times my friends and I watched Charlie the Unicorn, or a bunch of Smosh's early stuff. Like, we just rewatch that over and over again. Or if you're looking at TV shows like you couldn't just watch them whenever you wanted. Is one thing. Nowadays it's not just that there's so much stuff, it's that you can browse it at your leisure. You can watch it whenever you want, whereas like a TV show, it would come on like Monday at 7:30, and you had to either watch it then, or that was it. You just didn't see it. Like, we didn't really have recording devices back then. Like, some people had them, but it was really inconvenient, and so it wasn't that commonly used. And so because everyone was watching the same thing at the same time, it was like an actual cultural touchstone. You could talk about it, you could chat about it. And nowadays, we have some big events like that, like the Super Bowl just happened about a week ago, and that's a big event, but we really just don't have stuff like that as much nowadays. Whereas back in the day, if you wanted to watch something like, say, Seinfeld, which was the biggest show on TV back when it was on, pretty much everyone was watching it. And if you weren't interested, then you weren't interested. No one was going to force you to do it. But again, just like with Twilight, you would at least have a vague idea of what Seinfeld was and what it was about. And nowadays, we don't really have this one hub of pop culture, I guess. We have 1,000 small niches and 1,000 small communities that don't really talk to each other, and in many cases don't even know that the other ones exist. Like, for example, just go on Amazon right now, look at books, and look at books that have been released in the past year, and just look at the bestsellers that were released in the past year. And obviously don't count like re-releases of classics and stuff, but just look through them and ask yourself how many of those you even recognize, how many you've heard of, and if you have heard of them, how much do you actually know about them? Or if you are somebody who follows books pretty closely, then look at a different community that you don't really follow. Like, look at rap music if you're not really into rap music. Like, just look at the top streaming songs of the past year. How many of those have you heard of? How many are you familiar with? Or again, if you're just pick something like that, the biggest shows of the past year. Just pick something like that and look through it and realize that there are people in these other communities and in these other spheres of pop culture that are living completely different lives than you. And because all these communities have become so weirdly insular, they have, like, or hell, you could say inbred in some ways, like as strange as that may sound, because they are just like so focused on their own niche that whoever is creating in that niche, again, whether it be music, TV shows, movies, books, whatever, whoever's creating in that niche doesn't really need to worry about broader appeal at all. Like, they can make money just from having a small niche. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing necessarily, but it is very, very different than what it used to be. And because they only need to focus on this one niche and they don't need to worry about broad appeal, that's why we have things like Book Talk, where they just sort of list off various tropes and then authors will just sort of write those in without anything else. Like, I've complained plenty of times about stuff like Fourth Wing and other romantasy crap. And by the way, my next video that's coming out regularly, my next regularly scheduled video that's coming out at the end of this month is all about how I don't particularly like paranormal romance, but it is way, way better than modern romantasy, just so you're aware. But a lot of those are bad because they're just kind of tropes that are thrown in there without any reasons for them to be there, without anything extra around them, without any justification for why they're there. It's just tropes. Like, again, that's why they just sort of say enemies to lovers rather than giving an actual summary of what the book's about and who the characters are. They just say enemies to lovers, and the people in that niche are perfectly fine with just saying, oh, enemies to lovers, because I don't know why exactly. Like, why would you want to know literally everything about a book before you even read it? But whatever. And this goes for other niches as well. But because of that, that really makes it difficult to adapt these into any other format or to bring them to any other different audience. And I think that's why things like ACOTAR and Throne of Glass, or at least that's a big part of the reason why ACOTAR and Throne of Glass are just not getting adaptations. And I don't know if they ever will, to be quite honest with you, because these weird, like ACOTAR and Throne of Glass, they're just not very good books to begin with, but obviously they are striking a chord with their audience within their niche. It's just that that niche isn't really big enough and they don't really spend enough money to warrant making a TV show. I think we could compare it to a show that was big when I was young, The Vampire Diaries. Now, I didn't really watch the show back when it was on, but it was pretty big, and it was, again, just sort of following in the footsteps of Twilight, even though the books came out before the Twilight books did. And it was just like, okay, vampires, supernatural stuff, romance, teenagers, yeah, that's what the kids are into these days. So they just made that show, gave it a modest budget. It wasn't a huge budget show, but I think it had enough money to do all the special effects and stuff that it was trying to do, so it worked out okay there. And they again mostly focused on like romance and teen drama stuff, but there was still like supernatural storytelling there. So I feel like it was hitting a little bit broader of a target than Twilight did. You know, it's largely the same audience, but there are some people who probably didn't care that much about the romance, but they were still into all the supernatural conflict that was there, because that was, you know, maybe not the greatest, but it was at least still trying. Like, it was able to broaden its horizons a little bit, and as such, it created a classic show, which, again, I'm not super into it, but other people were, and it's still broadly remembered today. Something like ACOTAR, I just don't think it could do that, because, again, it comes from a community, it comes from a tradition that is just far too insular and far too, I don't know, far too demanding that the stuff that they consume fits into a very, very rigid, very, very narrow set of confines. And I don't really know what this means. It feels like pop culture is dead. It doesn't exist anymore. Instead, we have 1,000 smaller spheres which barely interact with each other. And each of those spheres, because they're not interacting with the others, is losing out on a lot of things for starters, but they're also becoming more demanding and less flexible in what they want, less flexible in what they believe. And I feel like that might just be a metaphor for society at large. Like, I don't think I'm really qualified to talk about that, but I feel like maybe, even if we're just looking at the United States, we don't really have American culture anymore. We have a lot of smaller ones that, in many cases, only really exist on the internet. And I don't know, I feel like this is contributing to disunity among people. Not that everyone has to be in lockstep and believe and say the same things, obviously. I'm just saying that there was a point where we all more or less lived in the same culture. And again, this goes for pop culture and culture at large. I feel like we all lived in more or less the same thing, and we had all these touchstones so we could at least kind of understand each other when we were talking about it. But now that doesn't exist, and it's like it's contributing to a breakdown in communication between groups of people. I don't really know what else to say about this. Again, this is not something that I spent a lot of time thinking about or scripting or anything before this. It's just that I am a little bit sad because we'll never get something like Harry Potter again, or the Hunger Games again. And while I don't like Twilight, I can at least appreciate it for a few things, which again, I'll talk about that in another video some other time. But I don't know, I feel like we used to have these big things and we could all have an opinion on it. Like, we'd all have an opinion on Harry Potter, or we could purposely try to avoid it. We could think it was good, we could think it was bad, whatever. But everyone at least knew what it was, and that's just not really a thing anymore. It feels like everyone has become more separate and we're communicating less. And I just don't know what to do going forward. That's about all, though. Again, this was kind of a rambly video, but thanks for watching. Goodbye.